Hello Year 12s and welcome to this video on the Outcome 2 Practice SAC. You should only be watching this video if you have completed the Practice SAC for Outcome 2. In this video I'm going to take you through the answers to the Practice SAC. You can find the set of model answers that is contained in this video in the Compass Resources section. I'm not going to go through the answers word for word. After all, you'll all have different styles in answering the questions. Instead, the purpose of this video is to go through the approach that you should use when you are answering the Practice SAC questions. As we work through these answers, please self-mark your SAC using the guidance provided in this video. Before we start going through the Practice SAC, I want to remind you of the strategies that you should use when you're sitting a SAC. These strategies are equally applicable to an exam. The first set of strategies relate to your overall approach to the SAC, and there are 5 things that you need to do in this regard. The first thing is to use the reading time properly. During the reading time, you should read the SAC at least twice. The first read-through can be reasonably quick. Use this read-through to decide what questions you will do first. I think it's a good idea to start out by doing those questions that you're most confident with. In that way, you'll build up your confidence and you'll also tuck a few early marks under your belt. In the second read-through, focus more closely on what each question is asking. Look out in particular for any things that might trip you up under pressure. This is also a good time to carefully read the case study or case studies in Section B. Now, one further tip on case studies. I strongly suggest that when you do a case study, you answer all of the questions relating to that case study in one block, rather than dip in and dip out of the case study. This is because it is inefficient to have to refresh your memory about the case study every time you answer a question in relation to it. In addition, sometimes the case study questions build on each other, and you will lose this interconnectedness if you answer the questions relating to the case study at different times rather than in one uninterrupted sequence. The second thing you need to do is be conscious of the time. You only have a limited amount of time within which to write your SAC, and you'll be surprised at how quickly that time can go. If you get stuck on a question, move on, although you must remember to come back to that question. On average, you have 1.5 minutes per mark, and therefore you're going to have to work efficiently. In fact, you should be able to answer the lower mark questions, that is the 1 to 3 mark questions, in less than this time. These lower mark questions will typically be define, describe, or explain questions that simply require you to recall knowledge. The trick to answering these types of questions is to really know the subject matter so that you can answer these questions quickly. This in turn will enable you to bank time for the higher mark questions. These higher mark questions will often be compare, distinguish, justify, analyse, discuss, or evaluate questions, which require you not just to recall knowledge, but to apply your knowledge. As a result, you'll need to spend proportionally more time per mark on these questions than on the lower mark questions. The third thing that you need to do is always try to write something. Don't leave any blanks. If you've revised properly, you will have all the knowledge that you need to answer the SAC questions. It just may be that the question is asked in a way that you're not familiar with. In such a case, you will need to think about what you know that might be relevant to the question. The point that I'm trying to make here is that if you leave an answer blank, then you're guaranteed to get 0 marks for it. On the other hand, if you put something down, then you've at least got a chance of getting a few marks for your answer. The fourth thing you need to do is to plan for your longer answers. That is, for answers to questions that are worth, say, 6 marks and above. These answers are generally likely to be answers that need to include a fair amount of detail, that draw on knowledge from different key knowledge points or from different areas of study, and that require you to demonstrate a logical chain of reasoning. If you simply jump into writing an answer to these kinds of questions without any kind of a plan, then you run a real risk of tangling yourself up. Now, when I talk about a plan, I'm just talking about a few dot points. Points that tell you what will be the topic of each paragraph and how you're going to sequence the points that you make. You can use the additional space at the end of the SAC to write down this plan, or even write it in the margins of the SAC itself. The fifth and final thing that you need to do is to check and recheck your SAC answers once you've finished writing them. Every minute is valuable, and so you need to make sure that you use every minute. I'd suggest that if you finish more than 10 minutes early, then it's highly likely that you've missed something out. Perhaps your answers aren't sufficiently detailed. But if ever you do finish your SAC early, then make sure that you do check and recheck the answers. No first draft is ever perfect. Now, if you need to amend your answers, then don't scribble out the whole answer and rewrite it. That's a waste of time. Use arrows and balloons. Use the additional space at the end of the SAC. The second set of strategies that you need to take into account are the strategies that are relevant to answering individual questions on the SAC. For each individual question on the SAC, there are three things that you need to think about. The first thing that you need to think about is, what is the question asking me to do? Because remember, your task is to respond to the question that is being asked. Now, you'll recall that I say that business management is about boxes and links. The boxes refer to the subject matter. Especially in Outcome 2, there are lots of different concepts that you need to understand. These include transition strategies, termination entitlements, performance management strategies, motivation strategies, and motivation theories. It's very important that you don't confuse these. The links are the connections that you need to draw between the boxes to properly answer a SAC question. For example, a question might require you to analyse how a motivation theory supports a particular motivation strategy. The boxes are, respectively, the motivation theories on the one hand and the motivation strategies on the other hand. But the question is requiring you to draw links between these two boxes. And after you have written your answer to a question, double check to ensure that you have actually answered the question that is being asked. For example, if a question asks for your opinion about a particular proposition, make sure that you have given your opinion about that proposition and not simply described the arguments for and against that proposition. The second thing you need to consider in answering a particular question on a SAC is, what is the task word that has been used? Is it outline, define, describe, explain, compare, distinguish, analyse, justify, discuss, or evaluate? The way that you structure your answer will differ depending on the task word that is used. For example, a question that asks you to describe on-the-job training requires a different answer structure from a question that requires you to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of on-the-job training. For the describe question, you simply need to give some detail about what on-the-job training is, including perhaps some of its advantages and disadvantages. However, for the discuss question, you need to clearly weigh up each advantage of on-the-job training against a related disadvantage. You can see how the structure of your answer is going to differ quite considerably. If you describe where you're meant to discuss, the maximum marks you can get is half marks. The final thing that you need to consider in answering a question on a SAC is, what is the question worth? That is, how many marks are allocated to the question. If it's a 2 or 3 mark question, then you're not going to want to spend 10 or 15 minutes answering that question. It's simply not worth that amount of time. Conversely, if it's a 6, 8 or 10 mark question, then spending 5 minutes on it is not going to be sufficient. You're obviously going to have to write your answer out in far more detail. The general rule is that there is 1 mark per substantive point. That is, 1 mark for a point that is made in a reasonable amount of detail. Okay, let's get stuck into the practice SAC. The first question relates to Fitness First, which is restructuring its operations to close its larger fitness centres and instead focus on developing a smaller number of specialist gyms. As a result of this restructure, Fitness First has laid off 340 employees. The questions on this scenario are designed to test your knowledge of termination of employment, termination entitlements, and transition strategies. A common mistake that students make is to confuse termination entitlements and transition strategies. So let's hope that you haven't fallen into this trap. Question A is asking you about redundancy and dismissal, which are two different kinds of termination. The task word is explain, but because you are being asked to explain the difference between redundancy and dismissal, this question is really a distinguish question. Distinguish is a task word that requires you to identify and explain differences. In this case, the difference between redundancy and dismissal. The key difference is that in a redundancy, the employee has not done anything which would justify the termination of their employment. It's just that their job has ceased to exist. Whereas in a dismissal, the employee has done something which would justify the termination of their employment. For example, the employee has underperformed or has acted dishonestly. Now, because this question requires us to focus on differences, we need to use words of difference, such as on the other hand and whereas. Note that it is not sufficient to simply define redundancy and dismissal. Instead, you need to clearly point out what the difference between them is. Question B is asking you about termination entitlements. Note that the question requires you to look at one termination entitlement, and so your answer should deal only with one termination entitlement. If your answer deals with two or more termination entitlements, then you will only be marked on the first termination entitlement that you mention, which means that you've wasted time and marks if you've described more than one termination entitlement. The termination entitlement that I have chosen to focus on is the entitlement of redundant Fitness First employees to redundancy or severance payments. The task word is describe. This means that you need to do more than just identify a termination entitlement. Instead, you need to go further and you need to add some more detail about the termination entitlement that you've chosen to focus on. The previous answer has chosen to describe redundancy or severance payments as the relevant termination entitlement, but in answering this question, you could have chosen any one of the termination entitlements that are listed on this slide. Question C is asking you about transition issues or transition strategies. Note that the question requires you to look at one transition issue, and so your answer should deal with only one transition issue. If your answer deals with two or more transition issues, then you will only be marked on the first transition issue that you have mentioned, and you will have wasted time and marks in covering any subsequent transition issue. The task word is describe, so this means that you need to do more than just identify a transition issue. In addition, you need to provide further detail about that transition issue, for example, by referring to the transition strategy that Fitness First could adopt to deal with the relevant transition issue. The previous answer focused on the transition issue of redundant employees having negative feelings and the transition strategy of counselling to address that transition issue. An alternative answer, though, could be one that focuses on the transition issue of the redundant employees lacking the necessary skills to obtain another job and the transition strategy of retraining those employees or providing them with training in writing a resume or preparing an interview so as to assist them to obtain another job. On this slide, I've set out three possible transition strategies, any one of which could have formed the basis for you to answer this question. Question 2 requires you to compare Maslow's theory of motivation with Lawrence and Naraya's theory of motivation. The question is therefore asking you about two theories of motivation. Be careful not to confuse motivation theories with motivation strategies. The motivation theories are Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Lawrence and Naraya's four-drive theory, and Locke and Latham's goal-setting theory. On the other hand, the motivation strategies are performance-related pay, career advancement, investment in training, supports, and sanctions. This question is focused on motivation theories, and in particular, the two motivation theories of Maslow and Lawrence and Naraya. The task word here is compare. This means that you must identify both similarities and differences and explain these similarities and differences. To answer this question, you need to refer to the information contained in the table that compares the three theories of motivation that I handed out in class. Now the question is worth 4 marks, so you need to identify and explain a total of 4 similarities and differences. For your answer to be a compare, you need to identify and explain at least one similarity and at least one difference. So, in your answer, you could identify and explain 3 similarities and 1 difference, 1 similarity and 3 differences, or preferably 2 similarities and 2 differences, as between Maslow's theory of motivation and Lawrence and Naraya's theory of motivation. You should at least have 1 paragraph that deals with similarities and a separate paragraph that deals with differences to demonstrate that you know that, for a comparison, you need to identify and explain both similarities and differences. In this answer, I've chosen to start off with differences. The first difference relates to the source of motivation under both theories. These are needs under Maslow's hierarchy of needs and drives or desires under Lawrence and Naraya's four-drive theory. The second difference relates to ranking. The needs in Maslow's hierarchy of needs are ranked so that a need acts as a motivator until that need is satisfied, when the next need in the hierarchy then acts as a motivator. On the other hand, there's no ranking of the drives in Lawrence and Naraya's four-drive theory. An employee can be motivated by all 4 drives at the same time. In identifying and explaining differences, you need to use words of difference, such as, on the other hand, another difference is, and in contrast. Remember, a comparison requires you to consider both similarities and differences. On the previous slide, we've dealt with differences, so now we're going to deal with the similarities between the 2 theories of motivation in a separate paragraph. The 2 similarities that I've chosen to look at are, firstly, that under both theories, they focus on the behaviour of individual employees, and secondly, that both theories can be difficult and time-consuming to put into practice. This is because where a manager is applying Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the manager needs to know where each employee is in the hierarchy of needs. And where a manager is applying Lawrence and Naraya's four-drive theory, the manager needs to understand the drive's profile of each employee. In identifying and explaining similarities, you need to use words of similarity, such as a similarity is and both. On this slide, I've set out the 3 motivation theories that we've looked at. Remember, don't confuse motivation theories with motivation strategies. The next set of questions relate to G&L, a major international fashion retailer who is a member of an employer association called the Retail Traders Association. G&L is in the process of negotiating a new enterprise agreement with its employees. As part of negotiating this new enterprise agreement, G&L has proposed reducing weekend pay rates, and this has led to a dispute between G&L and the union representing its employees. Question A is asking you about the role that employer associations and the Fair Work Commission play in determining wages and conditions of work. Note that the focus of this question is on the role of these bodies in determining wages and conditions of work. This is a very important limitation. So, for example, it is the case that employer associations sometimes act as the official media spokespeople for employers. And it is the case that the Fair Work Commission plays a role in unfair dismissal claims. However, these roles are irrelevant to the determination of wages and conditions of work, and so your answer to this question should not be referring to these particular roles. The task word is describe, so you need to do more than merely identify a role or roles. In addition, you need to provide some detail about the roles that you refer to in your answer. Because this question is worth 4 marks, 2 marks are allocated to your description of the role of employer associations in determining wages and conditions of work, and 2 marks are allocated to your description of the role of the Fair Work Commission in determining wages and conditions of work. The obvious roles of both employer associations and the Fair Work Commission relate to the review of awards and the agreement of enterprise agreements, also known as collective agreements, through the collective bargaining process. Question B is asking you to do 2 things. The first thing is to define the term agreement as it applies to determining wages and conditions of work. The second thing is to justify how the use of an agreement may assist GNL in increasing the productivity of its employees. Because it's a 3-mark question, 1 mark will be allocated to the definition and 2 marks will be allocated to the justification. You should know that there are 2 types of agreements that relate to wages and conditions of work. The first type of agreements is enterprise agreements, and the second type of agreements is individual employment contracts. Note that an award is not an agreement. An award is a set of legally binding minimum requirements for wages and employment conditions that apply to a specific industry. Awards were initially set by the government, but they're now reviewed every 4 years by the Fair Work Commission. Awards do not involve any agreement between an employer and their employees, unlike an enterprise agreement or an individual employment contract. Put another way, you should not be referring to awards in your answer to this question. The task word define requires you to state the meaning of, in this case the meaning of the term agreement. This is where your vocabulary sheets come in. You need to be able to rattle off these definitions quickly and precisely. That is a matter of rote learning. And this is what I've done in the first paragraph that you can see on the screen. The other task word is justify. This means that you must give reasons in support of, in this case, how the use of an agreement may assist GNL in increasing the productivity of its employees. In a justification, you can give reasons against the proposition that you are required to justify. But in such a case, you must show how the 4 arguments, that is, the arguments in favour of the proposition, outweigh the against arguments. However, because we only have 2 marks to play with here, the more logical approach in answering this question is to explain how both enterprise agreements and individual employment contracts can assist GNL to increase the productivity of its employees. The primary reason is that agreements are flexible. So, under an enterprise agreement, an employer and its employees can agree to pay increases in exchange for productivity increases. And under an individual employment contract, the employee's pay can be structured so that the employee receives a lower base rate of pay with a commission or bonus based on sales. That is, the more sales the employee makes, the higher is the commission or bonus that the employee earns. Question C is focused on dispute resolution processes. You can choose from one of 3, being mediation, conciliation, or arbitration. Again, the task word is justify, so you need to give reasons that support the dispute resolution process that you have chosen as being the one that is most likely to result in the adoption of the new enterprise agreement. Now, this is a 4-mark question, so you must make 4 substantive points. In addition, don't forget to refer to the stimulus material, that is the background information to the question, as it may contain some facts that you can use in support of your argument as to why the dispute resolution process that you've chosen is the most appropriate one. This is a good example of a question which requires you to think strategically, and that's how you can use part of your reading time. It requires you to think strategically because you've got to choose one of mediation, conciliation, or arbitration, which is the best dispute resolution process for resolving the disagreement. So, for example, there's no use in talking about arbitration if you can't think up any convincing arguments as to why arbitration would be the most appropriate dispute resolution process in this context. Now, for the purposes of this answer, I have chosen mediation as my dispute resolution process, and I've given two reasons in support of the use of mediation here. The first reason is that both GNL and the union have an opportunity to explain their side of the dispute to the other party, and this can lead to greater understanding on both sides as to the position of the opposing party. The second reason is that mediation ensures that the dispute is only resolved if the parties can reach an agreement that is acceptable to both of them. Each of these reasons is worth 1 mark. Now note that I've also used an example, and this example relates to the case study by drawing on the issue that has caused division between GNL and the union, which is the issue of high penalty rates or high weekend rates. The use of an example ties in the case study, and it also enables me to add detail to my answer. In the next paragraph, I have referred to two disadvantages of mediation. The first disadvantage is that the mediator cannot decide the dispute, so if the parties can't agree, then the dispute will continue. The second disadvantage is that for the parties to reach an agreed resolution of the dispute, both of the parties must be willing to compromise, and this might not always be the case. Again, here are two reasons, and there's 1 mark per reason. But remember what I've said is that in a justification, you can put arguments against the proposition that you're required to justify, providing that you also express a view that the for arguments outweigh the against arguments. And this is the purpose of my final paragraph, where I've said, however, overall, that is taking into account the two advantages and the two disadvantages, overall it would seem worthwhile for the parties to try mediation to see if they can resolve their dispute by agreement. The word overall is a very useful one to use in this context because it shows that I'm weighing up the for and against arguments and that I'm coming down in favour of the for arguments. Remember, justification means that I need to advance reasons as to why, in this case, mediation would be the most likely dispute resolution process to result in the adoption of the new enterprise agreement. Now, I could have written a similar answer if I'd chosen conciliation as my preferred dispute resolution process, noting that a further advantage of conciliation is that a conciliator, unlike a mediator, can also make suggestions to the parties about how they could resolve their dispute. Just to play devil's advocate, on this slide I've set out an alternative answer to question C, in which I justify arbitration as the dispute resolution process that would be most likely to result in the adoption of the new enterprise agreement. This answer is structured very similarly to the previous answer. I've started off by setting out the reasons in favour of arbitration being the most appropriate dispute resolution process. I've given 3 reasons or 3 advantages of arbitration. The first is that in an arbitration, the arbitrator decides the dispute. That is, the resolution of the dispute is not left up to the parties to see whether or not they can come to an agreement. The second advantage is that an arbitrator's decision is legally binding, so that both GNL and the union must obey the decision that the arbitrator makes resolving their dispute. And the third advantage is that arbitration is appropriate where there's unequal bargaining power between the parties. Where there is unequal bargaining power, then any agreement that the parties might reach may well be unfair. For example, it could be that GNL has more bargaining power, and so it will threaten to close down on the weekend, which means their employees will get no weekend pay unless the employees agree to lower weekend pay rates. Then, similarly with the previous answer, I've given a disadvantage of arbitration, which in this case is that one or both parties might be dissatisfied with the arbitrator's decision because it's not necessarily a decision that they agree with. They haven't had to reach an agreement between themselves about the appropriate way to resolve the dispute. As I've said, with a justification, you can give arguments against the proposition that you're justifying, but because a justification requires you to give reasons in support of a particular proposition, then you need to end up with some kind of overall statement where you basically conclude that despite the disadvantages of, in this case, arbitration, the advantages of arbitration outweigh those disadvantages. And that's the purpose of the final sentence, which provides that if neither GNL nor the union is willing to compromise, then arbitration will ensure that the dispute is settled. Question 4 is asking you about off-the-job training. The task word here is discuss. Discuss requires you to identify two sides of an issue and to weigh up both sides. In this case, the two sides of the issue are the advantages of off-the-job training on the one hand and the disadvantages of off-the-job training on the other hand. The information that you need to answer this question is in the table that you constructed in class about the advantages and disadvantages of off-the-job training. Now, in doing this weighing up, you need to compare apples with apples. That is, you need to weigh up an advantage of off-the-job training against a related disadvantage of off-the-job training. I'll come back to this shortly. The question's worth 4 marks, and each advantage-disadvantage combination is worth 2 marks. This means that you need to provide 2 advantage-disadvantage combinations in response to this question. On this slide, I have set out my description of the first advantage-disadvantage combination. For these purposes, I've chosen as the advantage of off-the-job training the fact that employees can be trained in a wide range of skills. Now, this comes with a related disadvantage, that is, a disadvantage that follows from that advantage, which is that where the employee is given a new set of skills, then it's quite possible that that employee will leave the employer to work for another employer who's willing to pay more for those skills. To weigh up an advantage against a disadvantage, you must use words of difference such as however, in contrast, on the other hand, while, or whereas. In this case, I have used the words of difference on the other hand. You'll also note that I've used the word significant to highlight what I regard as the most important advantage of off-the-job training. Now, clearly you shouldn't use the word significant to describe every advantage or disadvantage. Just save the word significant or a similar word for the most important advantage or disadvantage that you wish to highlight. On this slide, I've described my second advantage-disadvantage combination. For these purposes, the advantage that I've chosen is the fact that with off-the-job training, because the training is outside the workplace, there's less opportunity for the employee to be interrupted by workplace issues. In other words, the employee can concentrate more on their training. The related disadvantage, that is, the disadvantage that follows from this advantage that I've chosen, is that because the training is outside the workplace, then the employee is not also able to work in the business at the same time as undergoing the training, and this in turn may result in lost working time and output. Can you see how I've compared apples with apples? That is, there is an advantage of off-the-job training because it is outside the workplace, but there is also a disadvantage of off-the-job training precisely because it is outside the workplace. Now again, to weigh up my advantage and disadvantage, I need to use words of difference. In this case, the word of difference that I've chosen to use is however. And there you have the second advantage-disadvantage combination, which is worth another 2 marks. This brings us to section B of the practice SAC, which is the case study. This case study concerns Carbright, which is a car cleaning and detailing service business. It appears that some of Carbright's employees are lacking motivation. It also appears that customers are becoming dissatisfied with the service being provided by Carbright. Some customers have complained of slow service and that their cars have been returned to them not fully cleaned. In the case study section, it's very important that in each answer you give to a question, you refer to the case study. So make sure you make the most of the facts that are provided to you in the case study. Question 1 is asking you about motivation strategies. We've looked at 5 motivation strategies, which are performance-related pay, career advancement, investment in training, support, and sanction. However, this is where you need to read the question carefully, because the question goes on to say that there is one motivation strategy that we cannot use to answer this question, and that is investment in training. The question requires us to do 2 things. The first thing is to propose an appropriate motivation strategy that Aaron can use, and the second thing is to justify the use of that strategy to improve the performance of Aaron's employees. Now, because this question is in the case study section, it's very important that we link our answer to the case study. And you can see that throughout this answer, I have referred to Aaron and his business. Well, turning first to the first thing that the question requires us to do, which is to propose an appropriate motivation strategy that Aaron could use to improve the performance of his employees. Propose means to put forward and to very briefly outline. And that's what I've done in the first 2 sentences, where I have chosen as my motivation strategy performance-related pay, and very briefly described what performance-related pay means. That's worth 1 mark. The other 3 marks are allocated to my justification of performance-related pay as an appropriate motivation strategy. You should know by now that justify requires you to give reasons in favour of the relevant proposition, which in this case requires me to give reasons in favour of performance-related pay as a motivation strategy that Aaron can use to improve the performance of his employees. And that's what I've done in the next part of my answer, where I've identified the key advantage of performance-related pay as being able to motivate employees to work faster and improve their performance because it offers them a financial reward for doing so. Now, in a justification, as I've said, you can also put forward reasons against the proposition that you are justifying. In this case, I can put forward some disadvantages of performance-related pay as a motivation strategy. And the disadvantages that I have identified are firstly that performance-related pay can discourage teamwork. Secondly, it can encourage unsafe work practices. And thirdly, it can result in pay inequality, which can cause tension in the workplace. Now, justify means give reasons in support of. So even though I've also given reasons against the use of performance-related pay as a motivation strategy, I now have to explain why my reasons in favour of this motivation strategy outweigh my reasons against the use of this motivation strategy. And I've done this in 2 ways, by firstly explaining that Aaron can carefully monitor what his employees are doing in the workplace to ensure that teamwork continues and that there are no unsafe work practices. And secondly, he needs to have a very transparent process for rewarding employees with financial incentives so as to avoid the tensions that might result from pay inequality in the workplace. Just to recap then, where a question asks you about motivation strategies, you've generally got 5 that you can choose from, which are performance-related pay, career advancement, investment in training, support, and sanction. And it's very important not to confuse motivation strategies with motivation theories. There are only 3 motivation theories that we've looked at, which are Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Locke and Latham's goal-setting theory, and Lawrence and Naraya's 4-drive theory. Question 2 is asking you about on-the-job training. The task word here is discuss. Discuss requires you to identify 2 sides of an issue and then to weigh up both sides. In this case, the 2 sides are the advantages of on-the-job training on the one hand and the disadvantages of on-the-job training on the other hand. This is because the question requires us to discuss the suitability of on-the-job training for Carbright's employees. The information that you need to answer this question is in the table that you were required to construct as part of your notes on training, which needed you to set out the advantages and disadvantages of on-the-job training. Now, in doing this weighing up, you need to compare apples with apples, which means that you need to compare an advantage of on-the-job training with a related disadvantage of on-the-job training. We'll come back to that in a moment. The other thing that you need to remember to do is that because this question relates to a case study, in your answer you must link your question back to the facts of that case study. And you can see that I've done this in the answer on this slide and the following slide. Now the question is worth 4 marks and each advantage-disadvantage combination is worth 2 marks. So that means that you need 2 advantage-disadvantage combinations. On this slide I have set out the first advantage-disadvantage combination. You can see that I've identified as an advantage of on-the-job training the fact that the employees are trained using the actual equipment that they will use in their workplace. However, a related disadvantage, that is, a disadvantage that follows from the fact that they are being trained in the workplace, is that the training is done by other employees. And this may mean that poor habits are passed down from the trainers to the employees who are being trained. To weigh up an advantage against a disadvantage, you must use words of difference, and for these purposes I've chosen the word however. You can see that I've also used the word significant. This is a good word to use to show that you are weighing up advantages and disadvantages. Again, however, don't use the word significant to describe every advantage and disadvantage. Just save it for the most important advantage or disadvantage that you want to highlight. On this slide, I've set out the second advantage-disadvantage combination of using on-the-job training for Carbright's employees. You can see that I've identified as an advantage the fact that with on-the-job training, because it's undertaken in the workplace, there's less interruption to the operation of the business. However, a related disadvantage, that is, a disadvantage that follows on from the fact that the training occurs in the workplace, is that there may be workplace interruptions which interfere with the training that is being given to Carbright's employees. Again, to weigh up an advantage against a disadvantage, you need to use words of difference, and for this purpose I've used the words on the other hand. So there we have another advantage-disadvantage combination, which gives me another 2 marks. Question 3 is asking you about Locke and Latham's goal-setting theory, which is a theory of motivation. The task word that's used is examine. Examine, like analyze, requires you to describe key points and discuss advantages and disadvantages. In the context of this question, examine means that you need to firstly describe the key points of Locke and Latham's goal-setting theory, and secondly, discuss the advantages and disadvantages of applying that motivation theory to Carbright. The question is worth 4 marks. 1 mark is allocated to the description of Locke and Latham's motivation theory, and 3 marks are allocated to the discussion of the advantages and disadvantages of applying this theory to Carbright. In this first paragraph, I have described the key points of Locke and Latham's goal-setting theory. That will earn me 1 mark. But remember, you must not stop here. You've got to keep going and discuss the advantages and disadvantages of applying Lock and Latham's goal-setting theory to Cartwright. On this slide, I have set out 2 paragraphs that discuss the advantages and disadvantages of applying Lock and Latham's goal-setting theory to motivate the Cartwright employees. As I've explained, this discussion is part of responding to the task word examine. Now you'll recall that a discussion requires you to identify 2 sides of an issue and then to weigh up both of these sides. In this case, the 2 sides are, on the one hand, how Lock and Latham's goal-setting theory can be applied to motivate the Cartwright employees, and, on the other hand, the limitations on Lock and Latham's goal-setting theory in motivating the Cartwright employees. In the first paragraph, I've explained how Lock and Latham's goal-setting theory can be used to motivate the Cartwright employees. Essentially, this theory motivates employees in 2 ways. Firstly, by setting goals that the employees strive to achieve, and secondly, by having those goals set jointly between the manager and the relevant employee so that the employee takes on some responsibility for achieving those goals. In the second paragraph, I have explained the limitations on applying Lock and Latham's goal-setting theory to motivate the Cartwright employees. In essence, this limitation is that if the goals are too easy or too difficult to achieve, then there will be no motivating effect for the Cartwright employees. Now, in this discussion, of course, you have to weigh up advantages against disadvantages, and so you need to use words of difference. In this case, the word of difference that I've chosen to use is the word however. You mustn't forget that this question is being asked to you in the context of the case study, so it's very important that you link your answer back to the case study. And I've done this through the use of examples that are relevant to the case study. The first example that I've given is of a goal that could be used to encourage employees to clean the cars more quickly. And this is relevant to the case study because one of the reasons for customer dissatisfaction is slow service. The second example that I've used is of a goal to encourage employees to clean the cars more fully. And again, this is relevant to the case study because one of the causes of customer dissatisfaction is the fact that some cars have been returned incompletely cleaned. You'll also note that I have referred to Lock and Latham's goal-setting theory as improving the long-term motivation of Aaron's employees. And this is showing off my knowledge about goal-setting theory and the fact that by setting goals for employees, this can have a sustained effect on employee motivation rather than a merely short-term effect. Question 4 is asking you about performance management strategies. We've looked at 4 performance management strategies, being management by objectives, performance appraisals, self-evaluation, and employee observation. Now this is an example of where you need to read the question very carefully because the question tells you that there is one type of performance management strategy that you cannot use to answer this question, and that is management by objectives. This question is requiring you to do 2 things. The first thing is to propose a performance management strategy that you think would be effective in improving employee performance at Cartwright. The second thing is to justify your choice of performance management strategy. Now remember, this question is being asked in the context of the case study, so it's very important that you link your answer back to the case study, and you can see that I have done that in this answer through referring back to the Cartwright business. Turning then to the first requirement, which is that you need to propose an appropriate performance management strategy. As I've previously explained, propose means put forward a performance management strategy and briefly outline that performance management strategy. That's what I've done in the first 2 sentences of this answer, where you can see that I've chosen performance appraisals as the performance management strategy that I'm going to focus my answer on. That is worth 1 mark. That leaves me 2 marks which are allocated to the justification of my choice of performance appraisals as the appropriate performance management strategy. As I've also previously explained, justify requires you to give reasons, in this case to give reasons in favour of performance appraisals being the appropriate performance management strategy. And I've done this in two ways. Firstly, the feedback which an employee is given through the performance appraisal process will enable goals to be set for improving that employee's performance, and that in turn will motivate the employee. Secondly, by developing a plan for each employee as part of the performance appraisal process, Aaron is showing his commitment to helping his employees improve. And this will motivate those employees to improve their performance because they will feel that Aaron values them. Importantly, you can see that in making these 2 points, I have tied them back as to how the different aspects of performance appraisals, that is, feedback and developing a plan, how those aspects motivate employees to improve their performance. And that's important because the whole focus of this question is on how the chosen performance management strategy can be effective in improving employee performance, that is, in motivating employees to improve their performance. Just by way of a recap then, if you have a question that asks you about performance management strategies, there are generally 4 performance management strategies that you can choose from. That is, management by objectives, performance appraisals, self-evaluation, and employee observation. This brings us to the bonus question. Now, in your actual SAC, you will not have a bonus question. However, this is a really good question. It's a really good question because it requires you to draw on a range of key knowledge points, including from Area of Study 1. In other words, this is a question which requires you to look at both boxes and links. In this answer, the boxes that I have chosen are, in paragraph 1, corporate culture, in paragraph 2, management styles, and in paragraph 3, the interests of employees as stakeholders. Most important, however, are the links. The question requires you to link positive workplace relations to the success of a business. Not unsurprisingly, the crux of this link is how positive workplace relations motivate employees to work harder. You can see that in this answer, I have clearly explained these links. Taking paragraph 1, I've explained how a strong corporate culture will motivate employees to work hard to ensure that the business succeeds by achieving its business objectives. In paragraph 2, I've explained how a consultative or participative management style will motivate employees to work harder, which should improve the productivity and profitability of the business. And in paragraph 3, I've explained how a business taking into account employees' interests as stakeholders can motivate employees to work harder to make the business successful. Now, wouldn't this be a great question for a SAC? Well, this brings us to the end of this video. None of the information contained in this video is new. The issue for you is applying the knowledge that you have to answer the various questions. In particular, if you're uncertain about the meaning of any of the task words that I have discussed in this video, make sure that you look at the task word list that I gave you at the very beginning of our business management lessons. This task word list is included in the general folder in the Compass Resources section. Thank you for your attention.